Hi, I'm George Takei. This volume of Star Trek episodes contains the first 3 stories we filmed for our second season. At the end of Season 1, Nichelle Nichols had resolved to leave, to resume her musical career. She felt that Uhura was not being given as many opportunities on screen as her character deserved. Gene Roddenberry asked her to stay, but she was adamant about her decision. The very next day, she attended a fundraising event and was introduced to civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King. He told her he was a fan of both the show and her character. After accepting his compliments, Nichelle reluctantly told him of her decision to leave. Dr. King pleaded with her not to do so. He explained that Uhura was a vital role model for all the black people of the world. The presence of Uhura signaled that in the future, color would not be a barrier to talent and intelligence. His words struck a deep chord, and Nichelle went back to Gene Roddenberry and told him the story. She added that if he still wanted her to stay, she would continue to play Uhura. Gene was very moved that his vision had reached Dr. King. Second season filming began with a somewhat atypical Star Trek episode called Cat's Paw. It was almost a foray into horror storytelling for us and was designed to be our Halloween episode. The producers contacted the author of Psycho, Robert Bloch. Robert was already familiar with the Star Trek format, having written the first season episode, What Are Little Girls Made Of? For the new story, he wanted to write about characters who were capable of changing their appearances, but he wanted to shy away from the obvious Jekyll and Hyde splits. Once again, Star Trek's budget got in the way of what was on the written page. Some of Bloch's nightmare transformations had to be considerably toned down in order to make them filmable. Jimmy remembers that in one of his scenes, he is walking down a flight of stairs, and the script called for him to have a blank mind. Well, he blanked his mind so well that he tripped down the stairs on several takes. We moved on to the episode Metamorphosis and called back director Ralph Senensky. Having directed the first season love story, This Side of Paradise, Ralph found himself in charge of another unusual romance. The script called for an energy being known as the Companion, which interacted with the characters in the show. In order to cut down on the cost of special effects, Ralph devised ways of moving the camera which would simulate the motion of the Companion. He also used special lenses to give the impression, when looking at the shuttlecraft, of a much larger set. The lenses, however, created distortions, so were unsuitable when actors were in the shots. Next was Friday's Child, the location for which was Vasquez Rocks, a favorite Star Trek locale used several times during our series. The cast and crew had to film this episode in temperatures of 110 degrees, particularly trying for the actors in Capellan costumes. Ty Jandrews, who played our Klingon nemesis Cross, loved his costume. It was the first time he had been given the opportunity to wear a costume for a filmed role. He said that his Klingon regalia helped him get into the character and made his job easier. By the way, the show's writer, Dorothy Fontana, had originally envisioned the lead female character of Eileen rather differently from the way Gene Roddenberry rewrote her. Eileen offered her newborn child for sacrifice in order to save herself in Dorothy's first draft.
Welcome to Volume 2.2 of Star Trek. I'm Walter Koenig. Before introducing this volume's episodes to you, I would like to tell you about how my character for Star Trek came about. The foundations of the character who became Chekov were laid in September 1966, shortly after Star Trek had begun to air. The English invasion was taking American popular music by storm. The Beatles had released their 1964 film, A Hard Day's Night, and 4 days after our debut, television network NBC had launched the television series The Monkees, with one Englishman, to try and capitalize on this trend. Gene Roddenberry had seen the effect that these young musicians were having on his daughters, and realized that Star Trek could open up a new young audience for itself. Gene's memo referred to this new character as a needed crew type and made it clear that he should be a cross between the Beatles and Davy Jones. Originally intended to be English, a twist of fate changed that. As legend will have it, the Russian newspaper Pravda reviewed an episode of Star Trek. They complained that despite Russia's conspicuous presence in space exploration, they received no credit in Star Trek. So, the character destined to become mine suddenly became the fiercely patriotic Russian Pavel Chekov. I was told that Chekov was to be a one-time character with a possibility of a recurring role. Fortunately, audience reaction to him was good. So when George Takei went off to be in the feature film The Green Berets with John Wayne, I found myself getting a lot of parts which had originally been written for him. Gradually, Chekov became an integral part of the show. In our first episode on this volume, Who Mourns for Adonais, the crew of the Enterprise encounter a being who claims to be the Greek god Apollo. Bill Tice created one of his fabulous dresses for actress Leslie Parrish. It was once joked that the reason Star Trek female costumes were so scanty was because Bill couldn't afford much material. Bill himself said that he designed on the will they, won't they principle to keep people watching in case the actress fell out of her costume. For this episode, generous amounts of double-sided tape were used to ensure that Leslie would retain her modesty. The character of Mr. Spock was by now very popular, and so we produced the episode Amok Time. We traveled to Vulcan and found out a little more about Spock's people. This was chosen to be our second season premiere episode, and it has proved to be a favorite with the fans. Many of our episodes had recorded music slotted in wherever it seemed to fit. Amok Time was deemed worthy of specially commissioned music, however, and composer Gerald Fried created a piece which would often be heard in connection with Spock in subsequent episodes. It was a beautiful melody played on a bass guitar, but with no refinements allowed to the sound, which meant that the emotion in the music was not adequately expressed. With this arrangement, Fried hoped to capture Spock's Vulcan spirit and the purposeful suppression of his emotions. The final episode on this volume is The Doomsday Machine. It was written by acclaimed science fiction author Norman Spinrad. He was asked to write a part for actor Robert Ryan, who had expressed interest in appearing on the show. By his own admission, Norman crafted a kind of Moby Dick in space, and Ryan would have played Starfleet Captain Decker, essentially Ahab. In any event, Ryan became unavailable and the part was adjusted somewhat. Norman felt that he had weakened the character in his rewrite. For example, instead of Decker being found slumped over a chair, he was staring defiantly out of the view screen in what the writer describes as a very bad mood. Despite the writer's reservations, the role was handled admirably by William Wyndham.
Hi, I'm James Doohan, and I'd like to welcome you to Volume 2.3 of our 30th anniversary Star Trek releases. To present a convincing and believable science fiction future, all of us had to behave with the various gadgets and props as if we had to use them all of our lives. For me, the easiest way to do this was to invent what they all did and how they all worked. I once wrote down everything I knew about science and engineering and how it applied to Star Trek. I worked out what made the force fields and the tractor beams work. I also developed a sequence of events which I would follow faithfully in order to beam someone up, and a different sequence to beam them down. I can remember trying to explain this to one of our extras one day, who stubbornly refused to understand why I did things in a certain way. Although we all developed our own sense of how our consoles and gadgets worked, none of this was ever communicated verbally to the audience in the stories. Gene Roddenberry quite rightly said that in a contemporary detective story, the characters do not stop and explain the workings of a gun or a telephone. If we were to convince the audience that these props really worked, we should just pick them up and use them as if we had done it 1,000 times before. A technobabble explanation could introduce scientific errors. Our first story on this tape is Wolf in the Fold. For the second time this season, author Robert Bloch was invited to supply a script. This time, they requested that he write a story which featured Jack the Ripper, a character Robert had used before in his famous story, Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper. It was quite a challenge to find a convincing way in which a horror character could be transposed into a science fiction environment. Rather than have the character stalk around the Enterprise carrying a knife, Robert came up with the idea of putting him in the computer. Although he thought this was a good idea, he was wary of actually writing the story because he knew nothing about the workings of computer. Gene Roddenberry reassured him they would fix any technical problems inherent in the script. In the end, quite a lot of alterations were necessary because Robert had not exaggerated his lack of knowledge concerning computers and scientific equipment. John Meredith Lucas became involved with our show for the first time with our next episode, The Changeling. He was a science fiction fan and a producer on the television series The Fugitive. Gene Kuhn was considering leaving Star Trek. On the strength of this script and John's background in production and science fiction, Gene virtually handpicked the man to be his replacement. Gene Kuhn continued to produce our next 6 episodes, but then bowed out to make way for John. During our next episode, The Apple, the crew of the Enterprise encountered a planet of simple people who are enslaved to a vast computer named Val. One of our guest actors on this episode was David Soul, who played the young male love interest. One of Walter Koenig's most vivid memories of filming this show is that David asked him at length how one got to be cast as a regular on a television series. Although Walter can't quite remember what he told David, his answer must have been brilliant, because subsequently David achieved fame and fortune as a lead actor on the enormously popular TV program Starsky and Hutch.
Hi, I'm Walter Koenig, and I'd like to introduce the episodes you're about to watch. This is volume 2.4 of our releases to celebrate Star Trek's 30th anniversary. Our first show is one of our most popular. It is entitled Mirror, Mirror, and was written by Jerome Bixby. He had appreciated that we were doing quality science fiction and had already submitted a script called Mother Tiger about an alien found floating in space. She was the last of her kind and had been sent forth by her doomed alien civilization in the hopes that she could begin the race anew, somewhere else. Unfortunately, we already had a story similar to this in the pipeline, The Devil in the Dark, and so his script was reluctantly rejected. His writing was undeniably good, and he was invited to try again. Jerome knew that the producers liked to put our characters in unusual situations, and so he adapted a previous story he had written about an accident sending someone into an alternative universe. This time, he put Kirk, Scotty, Uhura, and McCoy into a parallel and evil dimension. The Deadly Years was our next show. Based on the premise that Kirk, McCoy, and Scotty enter a period of accelerated aging, Bill, Dee, and Jimmy had to spend 5 long hours in the makeup chair, having pieces of latex glued to their faces, to which wrinkles could be applied. Director Joe Pevney remembers that the transformations became a real problem to the shooting schedule because the actors would only be available for filming just before lunchtime. Chekov's role in this episode was written in such a way that I think he appeared younger than at any other time in the show. His fright at the appearance of a dead person seems more like the reaction of a 15-year-old than that of an officer sat on the bridge of the Enterprise. A curious thing also happened while we were filming this show. Joe, the director, wanted a tight close-up of my eyes going wide with fear as I stared at the ancient corpse. In any event, each time we tried it, I would blink and ruin the scene. The situation was so bad that 15 takes were required before I got it right. Thankfully, I have never had that kind of experience in front of a camera since. I, Mud was one of the 4 episodes I most enjoyed doing. It was the first time that Chekov was invested with a sense of humor, and it was great fun to play the swooning ensign in the presence of so many gorgeous android ladies. It was a particular delight to be working with Roger C. Carmel, who was Mud. He was one of those larger-than-life people who was always switched on, so entertaining to have around. As had happened with the previous season's Harry Mudd episode, audience reaction was very good, and Network NBC wanted him to be seen again, not just in another Mudd episode, but a spin-off featuring Harry Mudd in a television show all of his own. They wanted Gene to develop the lovable interstellar rogue and bring a series outline to them. At the time, Gene was so busy with Star Trek and several other projects that he could not find the time to play with the premise. Reluctantly, he let the series idea die. Welcome to Volume 2.5 of Star Trek's 30th Anniversary releases. I'm Walter Koenig, and I'd like to introduce our next 3 episodes to you. Our first episode is The Trouble with Tribbles, which everyone loves. From my point of view, when I first read the script, I enjoyed the idea of getting into a fight with the Klingons and showing off my superior pugilistic talents. I had no idea that the real plan was for the havoc my fists wrought to be only comic. Oh well, my flailing away to no avail at the large Klingon was amusing, and you know what they say about actors, anything for a laugh. Originally, the Klingon in this episode was to have been played by Tig Andrews, who played the doomed Krass from the earlier episode, Friday's Child. When he was unavailable, they contacted Bill Campbell, who had given the sparkling performance as Trelane in the first season episode, The Squire of Gothos. The Klingon character was renamed Koloth. The next episode in our shooting schedule was Bread and Circuses. This was a prime example of the abbreviated time scales worked to on Star Trek due to self-imposed quality control. The original script for this episode was not working the way either Gene Coon or Gene Roddenberry wanted. They took it upon themselves to write a totally new script based upon the original story premise. Director Ralph Sinensky remembers that he would report to Gene Coon's office and pick up the script pages one day in advance of actually filming them. Central to the story was the surprise ending in which it was revealed that the sun worshippers were not pagans but Christians. It was a plot point which Gene Coon feverishly rewrote to keep secret until the final scene. Ultimately, the script is clever satire. It points out the cutthroat nature of television and the rating system, Star Trek's biggest enemy throughout its original 3 years. As it turned out, this was the last episode Gene produced. He handed over the reins to John Meredith Lucas, his hand-picked replacement. Although he left the day-to-day running of the show, Gene continued to supply us with scripts. The final episode on this volume introduced 2 very important characters into our show, Spock's parents. Journey to Babel was written by Dorothy Fontana, who had become fascinated by the concept of Spock's mother and father after mentioning them in This Side of Paradise. She created a triangular relationship of conflict between Spock, Amanda, and Sarek, which Leonard Nimoy felt was a very worthy allegory of the trouble many adolescents experience with their parents. The casting of Spock's parents was expertly handled. Actor Mark Leonard, who portrayed Sarek, had appeared on Star Trek during its first season. He had even appeared with pointed ears because his character was the war-weary Romulan commander from Balance of Terror. Jane Wyatt was offered the part of Amanda. She remembers that at the time she was totally unaware of Star Trek. In fact, she thought that she was going to spend a week having a bit of a laugh. After all, she reasoned, men in pointed ears with green blood. It was all a bit childish. When she arrived on the set for her first day, she was taken by surprise at how seriously everyone took the series. Drama was being produced, not cartoonish acting. Having spent a week on the set, she went on to say she thought every man should wear pointed ears because they looked so good. Hi, I'm Walter Koenig, and I'm here to introduce the episodes on Volume 2.6 of Star Trek, released to commemorate the 30th anniversary of our show. Star Trek featured a few Vietnam stories during its run, about one each season. A Private Little War was this season's contribution. Although it was originally written by Don Ingalls, the writer who had supplied the alternative factor for our first season, his script was heavily rewritten by Gene Roddenberry. The story then became more closely parallel with the Vietnam situation that Don had originally intended. Ultimately, he chose to use the pseudonym Judd Crucis to represent his contribution to the script. I, too, had a problem with this episode. It seemed to me that the principal socio-political statement being espoused was that a balance of power was best achieved by a mutual build-up of arms on both sides. Although this philosophy reflected the times, I thought that in the 23rd century, we'd be better serving all civilizations by influencing a decrease in weapons use. On a rather lighter note, the script called for a creature to attack Captain Kirk. The Mugatu was created and built by Janos Prohaska, who supplied us with the Horta for the Devil in the Dark episode. In the script, it was actually called the Gumatu, but when DeForest Kelley kept saying Mugatu instead of reshooting the scene, they simply renamed the creature. For our next show, The Gamesters of Triskelion, writer Margaret Arman took her inspiration from the human propensity for blood sports. Turning the tables, she wanted to show how man might become gaming animals for other beings who regarded us as inferior. There were some good moments for Chekov in this show, but I remember that we were under pressure to complete this episode in time. The accompanying stress was considerable and appreciably dampened my enthusiasm. Since I had the least seniority within the cast at this point, my scenes were frequently the last to be shot, and so it was in this case. I remember we were racing the clock to film the scene where the drill thrall assigned to Chekov enters his cell. We had to stop shooting by 12 minutes after 6 or go over budget. There was time for only one setup, and the decision was made to shoot at the alien over my shoulder without a reverse close-up on me. I must admit it rather ticked me off at the time. But then, of course, I've always been more than a little ego-oriented. The final episode I'd like to introduce to you is called Obsession. In Norman Spinrad's first draft script for the episode The Doomsday Machine, he had written the part of Captain Decker to be a space-age version of Captain Ahab from Moby Dick. When that character was changed and the similarities blurred, the production staff felt they could get away with writing a story in which Kirk behaved like the obsessed captain from literature. If you watch carefully, you will see that one of the unfortunate landing crew members in this episode is actor Eddie Paskey. He was an extra on our show, and one way or another appears in nearly every episode. His character was named Leslie and can often be seen working at Scotty's engineering console on the bridge. Eddie always wore a red shirt uniform and was very aware of the shortened lifespan of many who wore red shirts. Whenever the script called for an extra to be killed, Eddie was very careful to be elsewhere. He figured that it would signal the end of his work on the show. In this episode, however, his luck ran out and he got nailed by the gas creature. Although he disappeared from view for the rest of the story, he miraculously returned to duty in the next episode. Hi, I'm Walter Koenig, and I'd like to welcome you to Volume 2.7 of Star Trek. During this stage in production of our second season of Star Trek, George Takei was in Georgia, filming The Green Berets with John Wayne. When bad weather delayed the completion of filming, George was away from Star Trek for a lot longer than he had originally anticipated. This unfortunate turn of events for him actually worked to my advantage. Several of Sulu's parts were rewritten for Chekov, and I found myself enjoying much more screen exposure in Star Trek than I might otherwise have been given. The immunity syndrome began its genesis to the screen while Gene L. Kuhn was still producing the show. He went to writer Robert Sabaroff and told him that what they wanted was an episode which did not feature any guest stars. There was still some money in the special effects budget, however, and so Sabaroff created the giant space amoeba. He based his idea on that of biology, treating the galaxy as if it were a living organism which was being infected by a giant single-celled organism. In effect, he posited the world within a world scenario, where living humanoid organisms were the galaxy's antibodies and the Enterprise a white blood cell. I've always considered that our next show, A Piece of the Action, is underrated. It has the same wonderful fish-out-of-water element of humor which later contributed to the success of Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. The anachronistic portrayal of Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock as Chicago hoods was quite funny. Way back in the very beginnings of the first season, Gene Roddenberry had come up with the concept, and so had writer George Clayton Johnson. The two had batted around story ideas. George remembers suggesting that they use C.M. Kornbluth's book called The Syndic, and Gene had hired him on the spot to write a story treatment. Immediately after submitting the story, Chicago 2, George was hired to write the episode The Man Trap, and his original was never developed. Somehow, Gene Kuhn picked up on the potential of such a storyline, and independently developed it with writer David Harmon as part of our second season. Following the success of The Trouble with Tribbles, the producers were keen to do more comedy, and Gene Kuhn turned this into quite a funny script. Our final episode in this volume is By Any Other Name. Alien beings from the Andromeda Galaxy attempt to hijack the Enterprise in order to travel home. The original draft had been written by Jerome Bixby, who had contributed Mirror Mirror earlier in the season. He was having a few problems getting the story to work and eventually handed it over to Dorothy Fontana, but she too got stuck. We had established that the Enterprise carried 430 crew members, and it seemed rather inconceivable that just 6 alien hijackers could control them all. Dorothy went to see Gene Roddenberry and explained the problem. He sat there thinking, absent-mindedly playing with a piece of black Mexican onyx, which Dorothy had brought back from a recent holiday. "What if," he said, lifting up the onyx paperweight, "the aliens had a device which could reduce everyone to a shape like this?" So, in the episode, all non-essential personnel were reduced to geometric blocks. Dorothy also wrote the scene where Scotty gives his all for the ship by draining his collection of alcohol to get one of the aliens drunk. When Jimmy shot relics for Star Trek The Next Generation, in which Scotty is discovered trapped in a transporter beam, he had a scene with Brent Spiner. Data pulls out a bottle from behind the bar, and Scotty asks the android what it is. All Data can offer is that it's green. Watch this episode carefully, and you will see where that line came from.
Hi, I'm James Doohan, and I would like to introduce the episodes which are contained on Volume 2.8 of Star Trek, being released as part of our 30th anniversary celebrations. Our first show is called Return to Tomorrow. Writer John T. Dugan. His original idea for this episode surfaced after he had been reading an article about highly intelligent robots. When Gene Roddenberry rewrote the ending of the episode, however, John chose to use the pseudonym of John Kingsbridge. In the original script, Dugan had wanted to leave Sargon and his followers as spirits drifting through the universe, rather than make them face oblivion. Our director for this episode was Ralph Sinensky. He used to refer to it as the big ping-pong balls, because of the receptacles used to store Sargon and his followers. He was finally shamed into learning its title by an actor he met who was such an avid Star Trek fan that he knew the stories verbatim. It was Ralph's suggestion to cast Diana Muldaur in a guest starring role for this show. She returned in Season 3 and years later played Dr. Pulaski on Star Trek, The Next Generation. Our next episode on this volume is called Patterns of Force and was written by our producer at the time, John Meredith Lucas. He was fascinated by totalitarian societies, in particularly Nazi Germany. Through his writing, he wanted to explore how such a brutal regime could arise and what was happening in the minds of the people involved. He also wanted to explore how such a society could single-mindedly rally the people and focus on specific goals with great efficiency. He realized that to succeed, you had to provide scapegoats to blame when things went wrong. The whole piece was shot using costumes which we did not have to make. As this episode was using a parallel to Nazi Germany as its premise, why not dust off some of those Nazi uniforms from Paramount war movies and use them? The final episode on this volume is The Ultimate Computer. This story was developed by a mathematician named Lawrence Wolfe who loved Star Trek. He came to Lucas with the completed script. While it was an excellent idea, it needed rewriting because Lawrence had become so fascinated with his M5 computer and its creator, Dr. Daystrom, that the script did not feature our regular characters at all. Even Captain Kirk was hardly in the show, having been superseded by the computer. Dorothy Fontana took the script and rewrote it. She brought Kirk's role to the fore to deal with the way he felt about losing his ship. In previous episodes, Kirk had defeated a computer either by asking it the unanswerable question or by confusing it with logic. Dorothy felt this was a trend in danger of becoming repetitive. So in this script, when Kirk tries out both on M5, the computer tells him to forget it. The captain is forced to dream up a moral dilemma to regain control of his ship.
Hi, I'm George Takei. I'd like to welcome you to Volume 2.9 of Star Trek episodes, released to coincide with the 30th anniversary of our show. This is the final volume to contain episodes from the second season of our show. I remember way back at the beginning when we were filming the second pilot episode, Where No Man Has Gone Before, I was talking to Jimmy Doohan about the series prospects. We shared a dressing room then, and I can remember telling him that I smelled quality on this show, which made me nervous because television held no respect for quality. I predicted that we would last 2 seasons at best. I had missed a lot of the second season, filming the Green Berets, and I returned to a show which appeared to be on the verge of cancellation. Fans Bijo and John Trimble had visited the set while we were filming The Deadly Years, and I had picked up on the rumors. Bijo remembers finding Nichelle in tears. Bijo hatched a plan to contact as many Star Trek fans as possible and urge them to write to NBC protesting the show's proposed cancellation. The volume of letters which had saved Star Trek at the end of its first season were nothing compared with the volume Bijo managed to create. The network simply did not have the resources to handle them. She had advised fans to be polite, non-threatening, and not to indicate on the envelopes they were part of the Save Star Trek campaign. That way they could not be discarded, but all had to be opened. Gene Roddenberry organized a bumper sticker campaign. Fans from all over suddenly started displaying Save Star Trek stickers on their cars. Even the NBC car park was infiltrated, and the executive cars were seen sporting Star Trek Lives bumper stickers. Well, they did the trick. Star Trek was renewed, and in an attempt to stem the flood of letters, NBC announced their decision to renew the show over the end credits of the next show on this tape, The Omega Glory. Instead of halting their letter-writing campaign, however, the overjoyed fans inundated NBC with notes of thanks. The Omega Glory had been around for a long time. Gene Roddenberry had first submitted it to NBC as the possible second pilot episode of Star Trek. NBC had chosen the Samuel A. Peoples script Where No Man Had Gone Before instead, and the Omega Glory had been shelved until now. Our guest star, Roy Jensen, played the character Cloud William. He remembers this episode with great affection because it was the first time in his acting career that he had been given a leading lady. If Star Trek were to be canceled, Gene Roddenberry had decided he wanted something to continue working on. Assignment Earth is essentially a pilot episode for a spin-off series about the guest characters in this show. Gary Seven, played by Robert Lansing, and Roberta Lincoln, played by Terry Garr. As Gene had met with success by describing Star Trek as Wagon Train to the Stars, he described this show as Handgun Will Travel in Space. In essence, this new show would be set on contemporary Earth and feature Gary and Roberta helping mankind through difficult problems. In some respects, it would have been a 1960s version of The X-Files. Unfortunately, the network passed on the idea. However, Star Trek was renewed, and we began to look forward to Season 3.